She didn't cry, that's what everyone remembered afterward. The woman sitting across from her husband of 15 years, watching him sign papers that would end a marriage, dissolve a life, erase everything they had supposedly built together, and she wasn't crying. Wasn't shaking, wasn't even frowning. She was just still, like someone who had already finished grieving a long, long time ago. And if you had been watching her face instead of his, you might have caught it. That small, quiet thing at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but something close. My name is Amara Sinclair, not a saint, not a hero. Just a woman who learned early that the ground can shift without warning and that the only person responsible for keeping you standing is you. My grandmother taught me that, not in one speech, just slowly over years. She used to take my hands and say, "Whatever happens, and things will happen, Amara, make sure you have something standing under your own feet, something solid. Something that belongs to nobody else." I was young when she said it. I heard it. I didn't yet understand it. I do now. My grandmother raised me after my parents separated, disciplined, quietly proud. She didn't talk about survival. She just modeled it every single day. At 17, I got my first real job, receptionist at a small architecture firm, answering phones, managing schedules, learning the language of a world I had no roadmap for. I showed up early, stayed late, paid attention to everything. By 19, I was the office manager. By 21, I was married. I met Daniel Holt at an industry event my firm was hosting. 26, the kind of confident that fills a room without shouting. Real estate development, just getting started, he said, but the way he talked about it made success sound inevitable. He was magnetic. I won't pretend otherwise. We talked for 2 hours that night. He told me about the company he was building, the life he was working toward. I listened, and he looked at me like nobody had ever actually listened to him before. We were married 14 months later. Our son Eli came along when I was 22, small and loud, and so completely real that I remember holding him in the hospital thinking, this is it. Everything else is just everything else. I kept working, kept saving, kept hearing my grandmother every payday, something solid, Amara, so I kept a savings account in my name alone, quietly growing while our life loudly built around it. Then Daniel's business caught traction. He came home one evening electric in a way I hadn't seen in months, said he needed help, real help, someone who understood the business from the inside. I need someone who won't let this fall apart, someone who sees this the way I see it. I was 23 and I knew what leaving my job meant, but I loved him and believed in what he was building, and I thought we were building it together. So I said yes. What followed was 11 years of being the foundation of something that had someone else's name on the door. I ran the finances, managed supplier relationships, handled difficult clients, retained the valuable ones. Coordinated construction timelines, oversaw property staging, answered calls at 10 at night when problems came up and nobody else wanted to deal with them. I also raised Eli, ran our household, made sure everything around Daniel functioned so he could focus on being the face of the company. On paper, I was his partner. In practice, I was the engine nobody acknowledged. At every award ceremony, every industry dinner, Daniel stood and gave speeches about dedication and foresight. His dedication, his foresight, his story. He thanked colleagues and investors and people I had never heard of. He never once mentioned me. I told myself the life we had was the reward. I told myself recognition was just a word. I told myself that for years. But somewhere along the way, quietly, without announcement, something between us began to rot. He stopped including me in decisions, stopped coming home when he said he would, started looking at me across the dinner table with an expression I couldn't name at the time. I have a name for it now: dismissal. Then came the small cruelties. My opinions were out of touch. I wasn't growing the way he was growing, said by a man whose entire operation I was running without a salary, a title, or a single word of thanks. I absorbed it. Adjusted, tried harder. The Sunday it ended started like every other Sunday. I was making dinner, lamb chops with rosemary, the kind that takes time and attention, and Eli was in his room and the house felt completely ordinary. Daniel came in, sat down, and looked at me with those finished eyes. I want out. The business stays with me. The house stays with me. Everything we built stays with me. He looked at me like the conversation was already over. 15 years, delivered across the dinner table like he was closing a meeting he had already decided the outcome of before he walked in. I sat completely still. The lamb was still cooking. Something warm and careful, tended for hours, about to go cold. And in that stillness, my mind went back to a night 3 years ago. This same house, 2 in the morning, Daniel out late. Me at the kitchen table going through the company accounts, and finding something that made the room feel suddenly smaller and my hands go very still. I never said a word, not to Daniel, not to anyone. I just closed the laptop, made a decision, and started waiting. I still remember the exact moment I understood what I was looking at. I kept going back, kept checking, kept telling myself I had made an error somewhere. But every time I checked the numbers, they said the same thing. The house we lived in, the business everyone admired, the cars in our driveway, none of it was what he said it was. And sitting there alone at 2 in the morning with Eli asleep upstairs, I made a decision that would take 3 years of silence and patience to carry out. What I found in those accounts that night changes everything you think you know about this story. It started with a vendor payment that didn't match any contract I recognized, a payment going out to a company name I had never seen against a project I couldn't place. I had been going through the accounts late, a routine reconciliation I had done 100 times, and my eyes almost moved past it, but something made me stop. I searched the company name, nothing in our records, no contract. No correspondence, no invoice trail, so I kept looking. An hour later, I had found 4 more payments to the same name, different amounts, same destination. A quiet, invisible drain running for months without explanation. I told myself there was probably a simple answer, an oversight, something mundane. I told myself that while I kept digging. By midnight, the simple answer had become something I couldn't explain away. By 2 in the morning, I had found the second mortgage. Let me tell you what it feels like to discover your house has 3 mortgages when you thought it had one. It doesn't feel like anger, not at first. It feels like the floor dropping. Like reaching for something you have built your life on and closing your hand around nothing. The house where Eli had taken his first steps, where I had convinced myself our life was solid and real and ours. Original loan $380,000. A second mortgage of $290,000 taken 3 years ago. A third of $310,000 taken 18 months ago. Total owed $980,000. Actual value of the house, approximately $760,000. We were underwater by $220,000 on a home I believed we were steadily paying off. I sat back and breathed, then kept going, because I already understood that the house was not going to be the worst of it. The business was worse, a line of credit at $160,000 with no plan to reduce it. Outstanding tax obligations of $90,000 quietly accumulating, unpaid supplier debts of $95,000, equipment leases of $65,000. The company Daniel introduced himself with at every dinner party, the one I had kept running for 11 years without a salary or a title, was carrying over $400,000 in debt nobody was talking about. Even the cars were leased, payments due, we didn't own anything. We had obligations dressed up as a life, total debt approximately $1.6 million. Total value of everything we supposedly had maybe $1.3 million. We were roughly $280,000 worse off than we appeared on paper, and I still didn't know where the money had gone. So I kept following the trail. Stock market investments, $145,000, every dollar gone. He had been trading quietly, confidently, the way people do when they believe they are smarter than the market. He was not smarter than the market. Client entertainment, private club memberships, personal expenses that had nothing to do with the business, $55,000. Spent performing a version of himself for an audience I wasn't part of, and then I found it, a serviced apartment across town, 14 months of payments, charged to a business account under a vendor category that didn't exist. Grocery deliveries, restaurant charges on days Daniel had told me he was at site visits, $48,000, a life running in parallel to ours. I remember the way my hands went completely still on the keyboard. The house felt suddenly too quiet, not peaceful quiet, the quiet of something held very carefully in place. I had suspected, the way you suspect things you don't want to confirm, that there was someone else, the late nights. The distance that had grown so gradually I couldn't say when it started. The way he looked at me sometimes like I was a problem he hadn't yet figured out how to resolve. But suspicion is a feeling, a lease is a document. Seeing it in numbers, charges, and dates, and a monthly direct debit with his name on it made it real in a way nothing else had. I sat at that table until nearly 3 in the morning. Part of me wanted to fall apart, cry. Wake him up and demand an answer for every lie, but I kept hearing my grandmother, something solid Amara, something that belongs to nobody else. What do I have that is solid? What do I have that is mine? My savings account. 7 years of careful saving from before I left my job, $140,000, in my name alone, never touched, and my grandmother's inheritance. She had passed 4 years earlier and left me $285,000, money she had saved over 40 years and put in my name alone before she passed. I had kept it completely separate, never used it for the household. Together, $425,000, entirely and provably mine. The next morning, I called a former colleague from my law firm days, a woman I trusted completely, now working in estate planning. I told her I needed to set up a protected account structure, For Eli, his name is beneficiary, not mine, certainly not Daniel's. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was going to be. Within 3 weeks, it was done. Every dollar protected. Eli's future, college, whatever he needed, safe and untouchable regardless of what came next. Then I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I closed the laptop, went upstairs. Lay down beside my sleeping husband in the bed we shared in the house we didn't own, stared at the ceiling until the room got light. When Daniel came downstairs, he kissed my cheek, asked if there was coffee. I smiled and said I'd just made a pot. I stood at that counter handing him a mug, asking about his morning, completely calm. So calm I almost didn't recognize myself, because I had made a decision in those long, dark hours. I was not going to confront him. I was going to wait, watch him keep going. And when he finally decided he was done with me, I was going to make certain that what he thought he was winning was exactly what he deserved to keep. For 3 years, I sat across from him at dinner, smiled beside him at industry events, while knowing the empire everyone was celebrating was built on debt already running out. Every morning, I handed him coffee and kept my face completely still. And then one Sunday evening, he sat down and told me he wanted out. He had no idea he was handing me exactly what I had been waiting for. Because what came next, the humiliations, the betrayals, the people I never saw coming, that is where this story gets harder. And that is where I found out exactly who I was dealing with. The first thing Victoria said was that I had a strong case. 3 decades watching women walk and having given everything and walk out with nothing. She read through my file, then looked up. 11 years running his operation without a salary. Without your name on a single document. Court, see that, we have a case. What if I don't want to fight? She stared at me like I had said something that didn't compute. She thought I was broken. Too worn down to stand up for myself, she had absolutely no idea. I drove home and stopped. A white SUV in my driveway I had never seen. I went inside. Her name was Serena, 29. Daniel had met her 2 years ago at a client event. 2 years, while I was managing his accounts, raising his son, keeping his company from falling apart. Within a week, she was at the house constantly with opinions about everything. She rearranged furniture I had spent months choosing, like resetting a stage, bought cushions and throws and placed them on my sofa without asking. Then one afternoon, I came home and walked into the kitchen and stopped. The walls were a different color. I had spent weeks on that kitchen, tested samples in different light until I found it, a deep warm terracotta, the color of something alive. She had painted over it with a flat cold off-white that made the room feel like it belonged to nobody. I stood in the doorway and felt something I don't have one clean word for. Not anger, something older. The grief of watching something made with care get erased like it was nothing. Daniel saw me looking, said nothing. That silence told me everything. I went to the guest room, my permanent address now, and breathed. I had 3 years of patience. I was not spending any of it today. Then Daniel's mother arrived. Her name was Carol. 15 years of careful civility between us, polite in public, just cold enough in private to make sure I always knew my place. She came with flat-packed boxes and said she had come to help me pack. What she did was move through every room with the efficiency of someone cataloging a storage unit, each item assessed, each box labeled in her precise handwriting. Bedroom miscellaneous, kitchen non-essential, winter storage, my jewelry gone, into a box without a word, not cruel in the way that makes noise, cruel in the way that leaves no evidence. I carried box after box to my car and said nothing. Then I came back inside and found Carol lifting my grandmother's photograph from the wall. A framed photograph, my grandmother at 60, standing in her garden, the one she had tended for 30 years. The one I had taken from her house the week she passed and hung in every home I had lived in since. It had been on that wall since the day we moved in. Carol was placing it into an open box. That's not staying, I said. Items on the walls are part of the household. That photograph has been mine since before this house existed. It goes with me. I walked over, lifted it out of the box, wrapped it in a scarf from my bag, and held it against my chest. Carol looked at me for a moment, then she moved on to the next room. Some things you don't negotiate, you just take them and you don't look back. Through all of it, I believed one person was genuinely in my corner, Claire. 23 years of friendship. At my door within an hour of Daniel's announcement, holding me until midnight, telling me he was making the worst mistake of his life. I believed her for about 2 weeks, then the pattern showed itself. I mentioned to Claire was thinking about leaving the city after the divorce. 3 days later, Daniel made a pointed comment about me running away. That exact phrase, not something he'd have landed on independently. I thought about Claire over 23 years, the way she brightened when Daniel walked in, laughed at his jokes a beat too long, always asked about him first, how is Daniel, is he well, before asking about me. She had been carrying something for my husband for a long time, and he had always known exactly how to use it, so I changed what I gave her. I'm so tired, Claire, I don't have any fight left. I just want a small settlement and to disappear quietly, soft, slightly defeated, completely convincing. Within hours, Daniel would settle back into his certainty. Claire thought she was playing me. She was a channel I had redirected. But none of that kept me awake at night. Eli did, 14 years old and watching everything. Serena's SUV every morning, every box carried to my car, the way his father looked at me like I had already ceased to matter. And Daniel was working on him, quietly, patiently. She's the one dragging her feet. I've been more than fair. Eli didn't get angry. He got quiet. The quiet of a child who doesn't know which parent to believe and decides the safest thing is to say very little to either. I could lose the house, the money, 11 years of work with my name on none of it. I had made peace with all of that. But watching my son look at me like he wasn't sure I was telling the truth, that was the wound nothing had prepared me for. And then one evening he sat across from me at my kitchen table, looked at the second-hand furniture, the boxes still in the corner, then looked at me with those careful, serious eyes. Mum, something doesn't add up. The way Dad talks about money and the way he actually lives, they're not the same thing. He had figured it out, not because I told him, just because he had been paying close attention and was smarter than anyone around him was giving him credit for. I put my hand over his. I know I told him, just a little longer. What Eli did with that conversation and what it meant for everything that came after is the part I didn't see coming even after 3 years of preparing for everything. I kept thinking about what Eli had said, the way he sat across from me at that small kitchen table and laid it out so simply, the way Dad talks about money and the way he actually lives, they're not the same thing. 14 years old, seeing clearly what two lawyers had not yet looked closely enough to find. I lay awake that night thinking about how much of what we call solid is really just performance. A lifestyle performed convincingly enough that nobody looks for the cracks. A defeat performed well enough that your opponent stops watching you. That last one was mine, and I was about to perform it better than anything I had ever done. I went back to Victoria. This time I laid everything out in front of her, 3 years of documentation, organized by category, every figure verified, and watched her read. 40 minutes, no interruptions. When she looked up, everything had shifted. The careful, professional sympathy from our first meeting was gone. What replaced it was something sharper and more focused. You've had this for 3 years. I was waiting for the right moment. When he demanded everything, he had no idea what he was actually claiming. No. He didn't. She was quiet. Then, Mrs. Sinclair, I misjudged you completely. I know, I said. That was the point. She smiled, slowly. The kind that means something real. Here is what we built together over the following weeks. The divorce agreement would state that Daniel was assuming all marital assets, the house, the business, the vehicles, everything exactly as he had demanded, but attached to that agreement as a formal legal schedule would be a complete list of obligations. Every financial commitment tied to every asset he was claiming, every mortgage, every debt, every liability. When Daniel signed for the assets, he would legally be assuming everything attached to them. The mortgages become his alone. The business debts transfer entirely. The vehicle leases, his responsibility, completely legal, precisely documented. He just wasn't going to read it. Men who are certain they have already won rarely read the fine print. The mediation sessions began 3 weeks later. Those sessions were some of the most demanding work I have ever done, and I say that as someone who ran a company for 11 years without a salary. I arrived at every session like someone still in shock, voice low, movements careful, no jewelry, eyes that carried just enough tiredness to be convincing, not dramatic, just present. The kind of tired that says I have stopped fighting because I no longer have anything left to fight with. I asked for very little, a cash settlement of $40,000, my personal belongings, shared time with Eli. The mediator, a careful, experienced woman named Mrs. Acaffer, looked at me more than once with the expression of someone wondering whether to push harder on behalf of a person who seems unable to push for themselves. Each time I gave her just enough, a small nod, a quiet confirmation, to let her know I was present, informed, and choosing this. I was choosing it, just not for the reasons anyone in that room believed. Across the table, Daniel was barely containing himself. He had walked into our first session with the energy of a man collecting something already promised to him. By our second session, he had stopped being careful altogether. He arrived relaxed and expansive, the posture of someone who has already moved on. He had booked a weekend away the previous week, charged it to the business account. I knew because I still had access to the statements until the divorce was finalized. He posted photographs from the trip, somewhere with a pool and good light and a table set for two. Moving forward, best is yet to come. Serena commented below. Carol commented below, the usual audience performing the usual appreciation. I read these at my kitchen table and felt something that wasn't anger and wasn't sadness, clarity. The clarity of watching someone perform their own undoing and knowing there is nothing left to do but wait for the final scene. Carol had been telling people. Through a mutual acquaintance, I heard that Carol had mentioned at a gathering that Daniel had been more than generous in the settlement. That I had accepted without question, that the whole thing had been handled very smoothly, said with the quiet pride of someone reporting something that reflects well on her son. She was reporting a trap, Claire called twice that week, warm voice. Gentle questions, I gave her exactly what I needed Daniel to hear. I've accepted it, Claire. There's no point fighting someone with more resources. I'm taking what's offered and moving on. She said I was being very mature. Within a day, Daniel would hear it. The last of his caution would dissolve. That was the last conversation I had with Claire that wasn't entirely constructed. 2 weeks before the hearing, Victoria called in the evening. His lawyer made contact. Asked if we'd consider delaying for a financial review of the assets. What did you say? That we'd provide whatever they needed, but the request had to come from Daniel. A pause. It didn't. His lawyer called back an hour later. Daniel declined. Said reviewing it would only cause more delays and he wasn't interested in delays. I closed my eyes. His lawyer had tried to protect him. Daniel had stepped around it because certainty felt more important than caution. Some people are undone by their enemies. Daniel was going to be undone by his own arrogance. I had just needed to give it room to finish the work. The hearing was in 2 weeks. I sat in my quiet apartment long after the call ended. 2 weeks and it would be over. 3 years of patience. 3 years of keeping my face still. 3 years of knowing what he didn't know and carrying it without letting it show. I thought about my grandmother, her own small kitchen, her own careful savings. Year after year, putting something aside so that whatever happened in my life, there would be something solid underneath me. She had never known about Daniel. She passed 2 years before any of this began. But she had known about the world, the way it moved, the way it treated women who hadn't prepared, the way it looked at women who had. I went to the shelf where her photograph stood, the one I had taken back from Carol's open box, and looked at her for a long, quiet moment. I think you'd find this interesting, I said. Tomorrow Eli would come home. In 2 weeks we would walk into a courtroom. And Daniel Holt, the man who had built something on my back and decided he was done with me, was going to sign for everything he had asked for. Every last bit of it. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the dark and went through every detail one more time, every document, every number, every moment I had been waiting for, and I kept coming back to one thing. The hearing was not going to be dramatic. There were going to be no grand speeches, no confrontations, no moment where I stood up and revealed everything. It was going to be quiet, paperwork, signatures, a gavel. And then it was going to be over. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have predicted even after 3 years of preparing for every possibility, was the exact moment Daniel finally understood what he had signed, the look on his face. And what he said to me across that courtroom when he realized. That part, I'll never forget it. The morning of the hearing, I woke before my alarm. I lay in the dark listening to the apartment, the particular quiet of a place that is yours alone, no one else's breathing, no one else's schedule, no sounds from another room you have learned to read like weather. Just still, just mine. I got up and made coffee and stood at the window while it was still dark outside. I had laid out what I was wearing the night before, a simple navy dress, low heels, hair pulled back, no jewelry. Not because I was still performing the broken woman, that performance was nearly over, because I wanted nothing about me to distract from what was about to happen. I wanted every eye in that room on Daniel. I drank my coffee. I looked at my grandmother's photograph on the shelf. Then I picked up my bag and left. 40-minute drive. I went in silence, no music, no radio. Just the road and early morning light coming up gray and clean over the city. 3 years I had been waiting for this morning. I thought I would feel something enormous, some great wave of emotion to match the weight of it. What I felt instead was very calm, the kind of calm that isn't the absence of feeling. It's what feeling becomes when it has been sitting still long enough to settle. Daniel was there before me, suited, already at ease, standing near the entrance with Mr. Pierce, his lawyer, a careful man who had twice recommended a financial review before signing. Daniel had declined both times. He glanced at me when I walked in, brief, the look you give something you have already stopped thinking about. I walked past him and took my seat beside Victoria. In the lobby, Carol had been standing near the entrance in her formal coat, the one she wore to events she considered significant. She looked at me as I passed. I nodded once and kept moving. Some encounters you don't slow down for. At the table, Daniel's phone lit up as I settled into my seat. A message from Serena. I caught her name on the screen before he turned it face down. She was not here in person. Not yet knowing that distance from this particular outcome was something she would soon want. Judge Margaret Osa entered at 9 o'clock, late 50s, a woman who had built her reputation on not being fooled. She reviewed the file without hurry, then looked up at the room with the expression of someone who has seen every version of this and is simply waiting to see which version today will be. Sinclair versus Holt, final dissolution hearing. The parties have reached a settlement. Mr. Pierce stood. Correct, Your Honor. My client is assuming all marital assets, the family property, the business, and associated vehicles. Mrs. Sinclair receives a cash settlement and personal effects. Victoria rose beside me. Confirmed, Your Honor. The judge looked at me. Mrs. Sinclair, this court wants to be satisfied that you have made this decision with full understanding and without pressure. Are you here freely, fully informed of what you are agreeing to? I looked at her steadily. Yes, Your Honor, completely. She held my gaze a moment, then nodded. Proceed. The clerk distributed the documents. Daniel signed quickly. Efficiently, moving through each page with the focused impatience of someone completing a formality beneath their attention. His fingers drummed once on the table between signatures, the restless tap of a man who wanted this done so he could get back to the rest of his life. I took my time with every page. Every signature was a full stop on something I had been writing for 3 years. I was not going to rush the ending. Then Mr. Pierce reached the addendum. I saw it in the stillness that came over him. The particular stillness of someone who has just read something they cannot immediately explain. He went back to the beginning of the section. Read it again. Turned the page forward, then back. He leaned toward Daniel. Voice low and controlled, a professional trying to keep something contained before it became something else. Daniel looked at him, then at the document, and I watched the color leave his face, not dramatically, not all at once. The way warmth leaves a room when something cold comes in gradually, then completely. He read the figures, the mortgage obligations, the business liabilities, the complete picture of what he had been claiming as his prize, then he looked up. Across the table at me, I held his gaze, no expression, no triumph, no apology, just steady, just clear. These figures are wrong, louder than he intended. The room felt it, that shift when something controlled becomes something raw. Something has been done to these documents. I want this stopped. Mr. Holt, Judge Osai's voice was quiet and precisely weighted. This court will have order. Lower your voice. He lowered it. But his hands on the table were flat and very still, the stillness of something being held in place by considerable effort. Mr. Pierce spoke without drama. He had sent written recommendations twice. He placed both documents on the bench without comment. The judge reviewed them, then looked at Daniel over her reading glasses. Mr. Holt, you had every opportunity to understand what you were signing. This court cannot protect a party from their own choices. The settlement is binding. Silence. Daniel stared at the table. Then slowly, with the careful movement of a person working hard to hold themselves together, he looked at me. He didn't speak, he just looked, and in his face I watched the understanding arrive. Not like a sudden impact, like a door opening onto something that had been there the whole time. The gavel came down, I gathered my things, I stood, and I left. Through the corridor, through the lobby, through the heavy front doors and out into the morning. The air was cold and clean. The sky had cleared. I stood on the steps and breathed. In the car park below the space where Serena's white SUV usually sat was empty. She had worked it out quickly, quicker than I expected. Behind me, somewhere inside, I could faintly hear Daniel's voice, rising and falling in the rhythm of someone arguing with something that has already been decided. I didn't go back. I walked to my car, got in, sat for a moment in the quiet. 3 years, that was what it had taken. I thought about the night I had found the accounts. That kitchen table, 2 a.m. My hands going cold as the numbers stopped making sense. The decision I had made in the dark while the rest of the house slept. I thought about my grandmother, something solid, Amara, something that belongs to nobody else. I started the car. And I drove home. I didn't let myself feel it until I was in the car with the door closed and the engine running. And then something happened that I hadn't planned for. I started to cry. Not from sadness, not from relief exactly. Something older than both of those. The kind of crying that is just the body releasing something it has been holding for a very long time. I sat there in that car park for maybe 10 minutes, then I wiped my face, took a breath, and drove home to my small apartment with the second-hand furniture and the sage green kitchen I had painted myself. Because the story wasn't over yet. There was still the aftermath. What happened to Daniel? What happened to Carol? What happened to Claire? And what happened to Eli and to me in the months that followed? That part is the part that made everything worth it. I painted my kitchen the week after the hearing, not because it needed painting, but I had been thinking about color for weeks, about what I wanted to wake up to in a space that was entirely and only mine. I chose a warm sage green. The color of something alive, something that had come through difficulty and was still growing. Eli sat at the table, occasionally telling me I had missed a patch. By noon it was done, mine, just mine. Belonging to no version of my life except this one. My grandmother would have approved. Daniel's world came apart the way things come apart when nothing real is holding them together in stages, then all at once. The mortgage creditors stopped being patient once the obligation transferred entirely to him. The house went into arrears. He tried to sell it. When you owe more than a property is worth, there are no clean sales, only difficult conversations and words like negative equity in careful professional tones. The business followed, credit lines froze, tax authority proceedings began, suppliers ran out of goodwill. The company he had introduced himself with at every industry dinner came apart quietly then quickly. By the third month, he was sitting across from insolvency advisors in the same kinds of meetings he used to dress up for, except this time not at the head of the table. I let it land without satisfaction and without guilt. He had made every choice that led here. I had simply stopped standing between him and the weight of those choices. That is not cruelty, that is just stepping aside. Serena left without a scene. One day she was there and then she wasn't, things gone, no note, no explanation. Some things end because they were never truly real. Carol went quiet. The woman who had told people Daniel had been more than generous had nothing left to say once the reality of that settlement became understood. Claire sent a message about a month after the hearing. I was at my sage green table with tea and a design college catalog in front of me. She said she was sorry, that she hoped I was okay. I read it, set the phone down. Went back to the catalog. She sent 2 more messages over the following weeks. Then she stopped. 23 years. She had made her choices week after week during the worst months of my life. That has a weight an apology by message cannot lift. Some distances once made stay made. Eli came on a Saturday morning about 6 weeks after the hearing. He sat across from me and was quiet for a while. Then, Mum. Did you know it was always going to work out? Those careful, serious eyes. I knew I had done everything I could to make sure you were protected, I told him. The rest I had to trust. Quiet again. Then I think Gran would have liked you. He had never met my grandmother. She had passed before he was old enough to remember. But he had grown up with her photograph on every shelf in every home I had ever made. Something moved through me that I still don't have full words for. Then he came around the table and put his arms around me. We stayed like that for a long time. No words, just the silence of 2 people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side still standing. My grandmother used to say, you know you have done something right not when people applaud you, but when the person who matters most looks at you like that. She was right. She was always right. Daniel came about 2 months after the hearing. He said he hadn't realized how bad things were, that he had made mistakes, that he was sorry. I listened. Then, I know, that was always the thing. You never looked closely enough at what was actually there. He asked carefully whether I might advise him through what was coming, after everything. He was asking me to manage it. I understood why. I had always been the one who knew where everything was. That had been true so long that even standing in the doorway of my rebuilt life, he still turned to me. But understanding why someone asks is not the same as agreeing to it. I told him I hoped the process went as smoothly as possible. That Eli loved him and I would never interfere with that. Then I said goodbye and closed the door. I went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. I enrolled in the interior design program 3 weeks later, evening classes twice a week. I had wanted this since I was 19, set it aside at 23 when I chose his future over mine. 36 now, not too late, never too late for the thing you always meant to do. My first real client came through a classmate 8 months later, a woman named Patricia, 48, recently separated, standing in her new apartment with the expression I recognized immediately, someone who has survived something and is standing in the space that comes after not knowing what to do with all that room. She looked at the white walls and said, I have no idea what I want it to look like. I just know it needs to feel different. Good light, high ceilings, a lot of possibility. We start with color, I told her. Something that feels like where you are going, not where you have been. We chose a deep, soft blue, the color of early morning, calm and entirely her own. When we finished, she stood in the middle of the room without speaking. Then it feels like mine. For the first time in a long time, it actually feels like mine. I smiled. I knew exactly what she meant. That evening, I sat in my apartment after Eli had gone to bed. The recipe box on the kitchen counter, the wooden one with the brass clasp, my grandmother's handwriting on every card, her photograph on the shelf above it. I ran my thumb along the brass clasp, the slight, cool weight of it. 50 years of recipes in a box that had been in my family before I was born. I looked at the sage green walls, something solid Amara, something that belongs to nobody else. I looked at her photograph. You were right, I said quietly. About all of it, the apartment was still. Outside, the city was moving and lit. Inside, there was just the kitchen and the photograph and the recipe box and the quiet that belongs to a person who has finally, after a very long time, come home to themselves. I turned off the lamp and I went to bed. Amara never raised her voice, never begged, never broke. She just waited and let him hand her exactly what she needed. If this story hit you, hit that like button and subscribe. New stories every week for the women who stood anyway. Now tell me, if you were in Amara's position, could you have stayed silent for 3 years? What would have been the hardest part? Tell me below.